G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. Now today, as always, we have a lot to go over. Now we're not going to be talking much today at all about what is occurring in Syria. Well, one thing I do want to say is if I was part of the Ukrainian military intelligence GUR, I would be arriving in Turkey or Syria with my checkbook and a flatbed truck. There is a hell of a lot of equipment from modern T-90 tanks through to book systems as well being taken by the rebel forces. Of course, equipment that could greatly help Ukraine, but I don't think that those forces are going to want to give that up at any time soon because there's a hell of a lot of fighting. And if we look back historically at Syria, there's going to be a hell of a lot of fighting. But it'd be interesting to see if any of that equipment does end up through maybe an intermediary ending up in Ukraine. But today, legends, we have, of course, a lot to go over. We're going to look at the maps. We're going to compare maps as we always do. But with this, as we always do, we're going to look at strategically important footage, maybe a new system coming online, which we will talk about. But we need to look at some geolocations too. Regardless of what the maps are saying, we need to look at where there are actually Ukrainian or Russian forces, in this case, both operating in an area to give us an idea of where that front line is sitting, but also what axes may be getting pushed on next. Then we need to talk about Kursk at length. Now, from day one of Kursk, I have questioned what the long-term strategic relevance of this would actually be and success. Originally, I thought it was going to be an in and out operation, and it's been an in and hold and reinforce operation. We looked at this over the past 2 days, looking at who has the ISR, logistics and artillery advantage, because I believe Russia has all three. I believe I'm correct in that too, and others on the ground have said that I am correct in this, but others are saying it is the opposite. So we need to take all that into the picture and have a look at what Ukrainian media is interviewing Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk and saying. We need to look at concessions. Of course, Zelensky has been vehemently against any sort of concession, with there's no end until the complete liberation back through to the 1991 borders, including Crimea. What we have been reporting over the past 3, 4, 5 months is that Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky's, his rhetoric, what they are saying is significantly changing. And today, with an interview with Japanese media, it is significantly different again. Basically saying, in short, that Ukraine does not have the military power to recover some of these areas, so it will have to be done diplomatically. So we'll look over how that will look. We'll look over how this may occur in the coming months as well. But of course, more questions get asked than answered in that Kursk thing too. Sorry I missed, we will talk about some military doctrine. But where I want to start is with casualty figures. Now, firstly, what I'll say is any casualty numbers coming out, whether it is the Kremlin, whether it is Kyiv, whether it is the UK, whether it is the Pentagon, at this point in time, I think it is all impossible to get those numbers, firstly, because you've got long-range weapon systems. How they're being counted is difficult too, so we'll look at that. So any figures at the moment, take with an almighty grain of salt. But let's look at what Zelensky has said. In an interview with Kyoto News on December the 2nd, President Volodymyr Zelensky disputed reports that Western media has been saying that as many as 80,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Saying recently, some in, I believe, the American press reported that 80,000 Ukrainians had been killed. I want to tell you, no, it's less, much less. He's refusing, though, to provided a detailed number of actually how many casualties are there then. However, we have to be honest. We do not know how many Ukrainians have been killed on occupied territories of Ukraine. Zelensky's comments likely refer to the Wall Street Journal on September 17th that 80,000 Ukrainian soldiers had died during the war and another 400,000 have been wounded. The Economist have these figures here, it's between 60 and 100,000. The only figure we've ever got from Ukraine was Zelensky saying it was around 30,000, and that was even disputed in Ukraine itself. People were legitimately laughing at that on the streets. We'll look at what MediaZone and BBC have been saying. But just today, what we see is Ukraine is saying that over 744,000 Russians have been killed, liquidated. This isn't total casualties, this is killed. So with that number, we'd assume the total is somewhere over 2 million. Like I said, any figures, grain of salt. But even at 80,000, this would be a 9.4 to 1. At 60,000, a 12.4 to 1. So you can see this is a huge overmatch of casualties, KIA here as well. And what I'll say is either the 744, the 80,000, the 30,000 is a one or more is bullshit. Zelensky may be telling the truth that much less than 80,000 have been killed. But on the flip side, I would say, well, if that figure is correct, then it is potentially, realistically, probably far less than 744,000 Russians have been killed. So I think most likely all these figures are bullshit, or at least one of them, which means, well, one of them is true, so it means the other ones then have to fall in line. Now, I do believe that it is highly likely that Russia has sustained more killed, wounded, and missing in action. But in my opinion, not at an over 12-to-1 ratio. Russia has the artillery advantage, the air advantage, a manpower advantage, and recently an advantage in morale as well. And in my opinion, that 12-to-1 or over is ridiculous, especially when we say that 80% of the casualties are from artillery. And Russia in some areas has 6-to-1, 10-to-1 artillery. And in no area, even if there's artillery parity, at least at no area does Ukraine have the artillery advantage to my knowledge. Russia suffered record losses in military equipment in November, with Ukraine's Ministry of Defense saying that 46,000 Russian soldiers have been lost over the past month. Again, all these numbers are impossible to confirm and large grain of salt. But there are some who go through obituaries and Facebook and social medias and all of this to try and get some level of idea. Now, Media Zone has stopped reporting, but their last report was that the Russian losses confirmed were about 80,000. And Ukrainian losses, they're saying around 65,000. This is actually including losses too, though, as you can see this number next to it, from 2014 to 2024. So from the 24th of Feb onwards is around 60,000. Now, both of these figures will be significantly higher than they are showing due to the missing in action. Dmytro, I won't try and pronounce his last name, but the head of Interior Ministry's Missing Persons Department in Ukraine, on the 7th of July, they have 42,000 at the moment who are considered missing in action. And as far as I'm aware, that number does not take into account the children or civilians in occupied areas either. So these are at least the closest figures, and we can see with this, yeah, Russia is ahead maybe 1.5 times, but not that 12 times more casualties. So let's go a little bit further in this. Now, Sam, Australian in Ukraine, I've had a quick interview with him before. He had this publicly on something I was discussing below this. I'm as pro-Ukrainian as they come, but that's bullshit. If Ukraine claims 700,000 Russians dead, then it's roughly the same for Ukraine. At an absolute maximum, if I believed it was a 2-to-1 ratio, then at least 350,000 dead Ukrainians. And this is where I said I believe that all of these figures are likely bullshit. Or if one of them is true, then the rest of them will be untrue as well. And then I talked to him privately, and I can share this as well. But we won't know the real numbers for a while. And there's always been confusion as to the KIA, WIA missing in action. Especially both sides don't consider that you are killed in action unless they have your body, even if they have literal drone footage of you dying. This has become a problem for a lot of the families who are expecting a payout from their, say, child's death, but even though there's a body, that thousands are considered, or tens of thousands missing, and that money is then not paid out. What we have spoken about is as money tightens up, it can be the incentive to put someone as missing in action rather than killed. But he says in general, I'll always say that it's 1-to-1. First-hand experience, I've seen 2-to-1. 2-to-1 being 2 Russians per dead Ukrainian. But just because that's what I've seen doesn't mean it's a rule everywhere. But to be completely non-biased, I'd say 1-to-1. Even 1-to-1, when you claim hundreds of thousands killed, is massively significant. And it is massively significant. And I have said time and time again for well over, say, 2 years now, that I believe at the end of this war, we will have over 1 million people tragically killed, including just everyone. And it is absolutely horrible. But what these numbers don't take into account are the scars, both mental and physical, that will occur after this war. Now, everyone who's here has some idea of military. I don't need to tell you about the scars that PTSD can put on soldiers following years and decades after war. But something not as spoken about as much is asbestos. In 2022, reports estimate that 60% of roofs in Ukraine utilise asbestos-reinforced cement. I've seen other reports saying that 70% of buildings in Ukraine contain some level of asbestos. Of course, asbestos is a horrible, horrible thing. It is carcinogenic. You can get mesothelioma, the cancer in your lungs caused from this. I don't know how publicly I've spoken about this before, but earlier this year, I lost my grandfather to mesothelioma from asbestos. He worked in mines since he was 14 until age of retirement. I've seen it firsthand. It is a horrible, horrible thing. And that is going to become more and more relevant in the following months, years, and decades after the war, including that mental impact on soldiers, civilians, absolutely everyone. It's a horrible, horrible thing. So let's have a look at the maps, of course. Here you have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The red check today is area that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. Now, where I want to come down into first is Velyka Novosilka. What Russia is doing is trying to expand this area that they have here. Again, there is a threat of this being cut off, so they're trying to balloon out and make this area larger so it is not at as much risk of being cut off by the Ukrainian forces. But what I spoke about yesterday is that these two roads have not just been strategically cut off, they have been physically cut off by forces. This road is a real threat from strategic cutoff of just bombs landing drones. It is 3 kilometers away from the front line in Rivnepil. The front line could potentially be further up than this map is showing, so well within range of things like drones. So let's get rid of these, but you can see where that movement is on this map. Now, we didn't have a Syriac map yesterday, but we do have one for you today. So we bring up Syriac, and he is showing similar, but overall thicker, if that makes sense. Situation Velyka Novosilka, a front Russian army cut the northern supply route to Velyka and took control of the locality of Novaya Komar, adjacent to the Mokry Yali River. This is a major upset for this front line in here, and will really then cut some of the logistic supplies. Yes, things can move through, but again, you are crossing areas in here that could become very, very damp with snow, rain, and mud, especially this time of year. This road through here, I would be very concerned running down this road adjacent to the front line or parallel in some areas here on the risk of drones. Now, I want to show you an interesting drone. So this is on the deep state map. So we're talking just down in around where my cursor is here, about 2 kilometers behind the front line. What we see here is a Russian mole ground drone. This is something we're seeing Russia and Ukraine use actually more and more, is a wheeled or tracked smaller drone that is not in the air, that's running on the ground here with explosives laden and then exploding in things like buildings or trenches or other fortifications. And this is at that geolocation in Velyka Novosilka. This is a Russian one. Now, you'll see some interesting bloody camera work here as it goes sort of into the garage, makes a bang, and then has a very, very large explosion. Of course, weight is not as crucial on something like this as a Ukrainian or Russian flying drone. So we can see that. But there is a lot of other footage around this area from Russian drones. And what I will say is what this footage is also showing me is the increased ISR Russia has over somewhere like Velyka Novosilka as well, which can become, of course, a huge, huge problem, seeing where that drone has then struck at that vicinity. So it is very interesting to see what will happen there. But the reason I bring up that distances is this is about, that 2 Ks from there we saw that drone operating, and it's this distance in here, which is more concerning at 3 Ks. So not that much more than that, that this road, if this comes under some sort of strategic cutoff or threat or just large losses on here, Velyka Novosilka is going to come under real problems. So let's have a look at other areas in the front line. We'll move across to Kurakhove. Now to the south of Kurakhove, you can see a Russian advancement. Also to the north, Beretsky, Stary Turny, that the Russians have got all on the northern flank of this reservoir in here, putting everything down here in large risk of further cut off. Will we see it possible for the Russians to cross down here where this dam was exploded? Well, I guess in the next 24 to 48 hours, we will see. But still not showing the amount of control in Kurakhove as a lot of other maps are showing, especially deep state here. Syriac here, you can see the amount of Russian control in the center of Kurakhove that is showing just on that edge. But he also is confirming the movement up into Stary Turny by the Russian forces. What I will say is Syriac is showing less control than the deep state map in this front, which is a very interesting piece to see. Now, let's further move our way up, further ground to the north of Zorya, made by the Russian forces in this direction. So still moving, Velyka and Kurakhove, Pokrovsk front, still moving forward. It'll be interesting to see what occurs over the next coming weeks and months in here. Will winter slow it down? Will it not? Well, wait and see. So let's talk about Toretsk. So Noel reports shows this. Now, this isn't easy to see because this is then, of course, satellite imagery, and this is not. But what you can see is these are the two Catechons spoils from mines in here, that there is Russian control all the way up into then in between these, and a lot of this grey zone here coming under control of the Russian forces. Now, where this comes from, I believe, is, let me show you the geolocation first, is this. So this is the same area. Then I've put the red circle in here, and what we can see, again, I'll put this footage onto the Telegram if you'd like to see it, but you can see the destruction in Toretsk itself, but these are Russian forces moving in here, and a number of successful drone strikes and droppings on those forces from Ukrainian elements, but the confirmation that these forces are operating in this area, of course, putting to the south and the north at risk in that front. Now, let's continue moving our way up. Now, we have Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar front. We can see this small spire coming out here where we saw both Russian forces and then reconnaissance forces operating as well. This geolocation here, so just into the red zone here, we see from a Russian page showing the strikes against Ukrainians in fortified positions in here. Again, take note of the snow on the ground, but a drone strike in there, but confirming the Ukrainian forces hold positions, or held positions at least, that far in. It's hard to know when does something go from grey to red. Same in Toretsk. Do the Russians hold that position, or were they present? Very difficult to know. That's why I think the width of grey zone should be very large, and it shouldn't be like red and grey. It should almost be like colour shift into each one. But interesting to see there, definitely a presence further in. Now, let's zoom out, move our way up. Pishani front. Second day in a row, we see more movement out to the south of Pishani. Like I've spoken about a million times, logistics into here is very difficult since then this front reached a sort of Senkove area, cutting off any supply across the Oskil, and then Syriac shows very similar direction here, further ground being made. I think we will continue seeing ground made there for some time. So let's move our way up and then into Kursk. Now, I don't believe we see any shift at all in Kursk. No, we do not. But there is a lot of threat in Kursk for how these actions will go. Sorry, I just missed from yesterday to today. We do see that Deep State has confirmed the grey zone has disappeared in this area to the south of Vasiole, Glashkovo as well. So what I shared with you yesterday was this, and there's some bits in this that are going to become relevant. First time I left Suja 2 days ago. It's not good, but nowhere near as bad as I thought. We have not been as concerned about security as other areas of operations because the drones overhead are more prevalent and they see absolutely everything. And if you know that you're being seen, one of the things is you don't need to actually be as secure because you just assume that it's been seen. He also talks about how prevalent the Russian electronic warfare is here and the problems this makes on infills and exfills, as well as that Starlink turns off as soon as you cross. But he does speak about the rumours from YouTubers, from people in the army to the media about a withdrawal out of here. But he does say the amount of assets he sees that are allocated to here and going into here, that he believes that the Ukrainians are intending to stay, and saying that he does not see a withdrawal occurring. So let's then look at what Kyiv Independent has said in one of their articles, specifically about Kursk. Nearly 4 months after Kyiv launched a surprise cross-border incursion into Russia's Kursk Oblast, some Ukrainian soldiers are increasingly pessimistic about the costly operation, saying aviation is a factor. They're throwing all the aerial bombs every night, destroying us little by little. Now, when Ukrainian forces unexpectedly opened a new front in the northeast, it was a significant morale-boosting moment for the country. But what I will say in this is, in attritional war, propaganda needs to support military operations. Military operations should not be the foundation of propaganda. And this can go into the optics in this war, where I believe has been probably the biggest downfall for Ukraine, has been the concern with how it is seen, not exactly what is happening. So the concern oh, we're taking this ground, or the concern if you're falling back, like in Volchansk. I believe the best thing for Ukraine would have actually been a withdrawal out of Volchansk, do what the Russians are doing to Ukraine in Kursk, that you have to now man this area and fortifications lines and push through. It's been so much emphasis put on how things are seen, not exactly how things are actually going. The concern for optics absolutely has, in my opinion, had a tactical and strategic effect on Ukrainian operations in the negative. So this is what I mean about propaganda. Combat operations should be shallow and focusing on destroying enemy resources when you have then a attritional war, but not focused on gaining terrain. The propaganda is used to support military operations, not the other way around. So you don't have a military operation that is propaganda. You have your military op, and then propaganda then supports this, where I believe Kursk was the other way around, and it's sort of hinting at this here. While unable to quickly prevent a deepening Ukrainian advance, Russian forces eventually began to counterattack. And they're saying that there's been a couple of waves, and they're saying that in December, they're expecting another one with 60,000 Russian troops deployed to Kursk. But remember, the Russian forces couldn't quickly prevent this or stabilise it. But we are hearing from other intelligence services that there were 70,000 Russians already present there for a launch into Sumy. That doesn't make sense. But what I will say in here is, at least in the start of the operation into Kursk, it was Ukraine's best equipment and soldiers versus conscripts here. So a lot of the best Western equipment and some of the best trained soldiers ended up in Kursk, not on other areas of the front line, which has caused a huge problem. Ukraine's grip on Russian territory has given it leverage in potential negotiations, but that grip is weakening, saying that 40% has been retaken by the Russians. I believe it's probably more than that. It's probably near the 50%. But let's talk about those optics, politics, how things are seen in this. This is attritional warfare doctrine. In attritional war, any terrain that does not have a vital industrial centre is irrelevant. It is always better to retreat and preserve forces, regardless of the political consequences. Fighting on disadvantageous terrain burns up units, losing experienced soldiers who are the key to victory. This is what I said. The soldiers initially in Kursk were Russian conscripts. The Ukrainians across was, you see the Charlies, the Abrams, the Challengers, the Leopards working in there, the M2 Bradleys, and the better soldiers in there. That you are burning up, in my opinion, people that are absolutely the key to further successes. This goes back into the Germans' obsession with Stalingrad in 1942 as a prime example of fighting on unfavourable terrain for political reasons. Germany burned up vital units that it could not afford to lose, simply to capture a city bearing Stalin's name. So for the morale boost, for the embarrassment to Putin, again, if we go back in that, this is burning up vital units, and it is propaganda, military operation, not a military operation with propaganda supporting it. You can see why I've been concerned about the actual success of this from day one. The goal in this is to force the enemy to expend vital material and strategic reserves on strategically meaningless operations. A key pitfall to avoid is being dragged into the very same trap that has been set for the enemy. So what I believe Ukraine was trying to do, and really has been hinting at this, is Ukraine pushing to Kursk to try and get Russia to expend vital material and reserves to stop that offensive. But I believe Ukraine has fallen into the pitfall, into the same trap that it tried to set for Russia. That now it holds, say, 500 square kilometres in there. You've got some of your best troops and your best machinery in there too. That's now tied up, and now that Russia has had time to redeploy, that if Ukraine do pull out, what's stopping Russia with that 60,000, if we believe that number, of then pushing into Sumy. So they may not actually be able now to withdraw out of there, which is causing then a large problem, and Ukraine have to push more troops and soldiers into here, what of course is having an effect in the south and the east, as I believe Kursk has jeopardised that significantly. Russia managed to capture over 1,600 square kilometres, roughly the size of London, in Donbass between September and November, despite spending significant amounts of men and material in the process. It is attritional war. Any movement anywhere by anyone is going to have significant amounts of losses. What it's going to be is who can actually maintain and replace those losses. According to Reuters, Ukraine at its peak in Kursk had about 1,380 square kilometres, saying Ukraine currently controls about 800 square kilometres in Kursk. Now, I think it is significantly less than this, but regardless, we can go with that number. Now, let's go in here. as the front line of Kursk Oblast more or less stabilises and the Ukrainians are once again on the defensive, more soldiers, many of whom said their units took heavy losses in the area, are beginning to question the incursion. Kyiv has allocated substantial resources for the operation, which is also supported by the Western long-range strike capabilities to hold the lands at any cost. And this is what I said, the cost into here. I believe if we go back into the doctrine is where Ukraine has been dragged into its very same trap for strategically meaningless or irrelevant areas because there's no vital industrial centre in here, but has had redeployed a lot of experienced soldiers who would be the key to further success or further training. Zelensky has hailed the Kursk operations, reiterating that it has enabled Ukraine to return a significant number of Ukrainians from Russian captivity, because they took a lot of POWs, and prevent reoccupation of the bordering of Sumy, although it does seem like that Russia has now allocated a heap of resources into then Kursk that could cross into Sumy if Ukraine had to pull out. Zelensky saying, instead of a buffer zone on the territory of Ukraine, which the Russians planned, we've created a buffer zone near our borders on Russian territory. Observing how Russian troops were advancing quicker in Donetsk from the distance, Ukrainian soldiers stressed that elite Ukrainian units deployed to invade Russia could have instead been used to hold the Eastern Front. That's what I said from day one. Not one soldier whom I speak with understands why we are here, adding that many guys from his unit refused to be deployed in the Kursk operation and simply went home. Other soldiers, including other servicemen from the elite 80th Brigade, have suggested that Kursk incursion would likely be destined for a short life and that it was probably a Ukrainian attempt to distract the public from the worsening situation in the Donbass. As you can see, what I'm getting at around optics, military strategy in attritional warfare, and how this can be detrimental. I'm 100% sure that they'll force us out of Kursk Oblast. It's just a matter of time. It's a pity that people are dying for PR. Western and Ukrainian military experts are divided on the operation's strategic value. Now, what I will say is the vocal military experts are divided. The military experts behind closed doors or in more niche areas, writing papers somewhere that no one reads, it's not woohoo on YouTube or Twitter, there is no division. It is maybe agnostic to the situation, but at this time, everyone I know is negative towards it, or agnostic, being like, well, I'm staying open because maybe we will see success here. But 95% are saying it's not good, potentially will, and I always leave that door open. Potentially there's some 5D, 6D, 8D, 20D chess game going on, but how it's looking, Occam's razor, how it's looking is probably how it's going, is negative. And I believe most military experts are seeing this as that it is jeopardising other areas and tying up critical things Ukraine needs. Ukraine talk about not having enough weapons or men, with a shitload of it tied up in this operation that holds no areas of massive significance, such as military areas or vital industrial centres by the Russian forces. Now, analysts of the Blackbird Group, analysing the war closely through an open source, said that there appear to be more negatives in the operation, with Ukraine prioritising the operation pretty high despite the deteriorating Donbass situation. So it seems like this is the first main effort, not where it's falling day to day. Experts have said the operation's pros include Ukraine bringing the war to Russian territory and enhancing the protection of border areas in Ukraine's northern Sumy. I actually believe it may have jeopardised some of the situation there further because of how good the fortifications Ukraine is building in Kursk, how many soldiers are there, rather than just fortifying the actual border. Bringing the war to Russian territory, at the end of the day, this is still part of that further PR, still part of a propaganda effort to impact the Russians in this way, but how much effect has that realistically had? Well, Russia has record high recruitment at the moment. The operation also forced Russia to divert some troops that could have been deployed elsewhere in its own Kursk Oblast to suffer high cost to reclaim the territories. Ukraine claimed in late October that Russia had lost over 17,000 numbers in Kursk. Now, again, with any numbers, grain of salt. But what I'll say is there's no evidence of redeployment en masse. So there is some evidence of maybe some drone units, maybe some SF units, maybe whatever units being redeployed, but it's not like everyone on the axis of Pokrovsk has now been moved to the axis of Sumy and Kursk. It is unclear how long Ukraine can realistically occupy the patch of Russian territory. Among the struggles that Ukrainian troops face include the apparent lack of high-quality fortifications, at least in large amounts, and good defensive terrain. This, of course, needs to take into account how this is going to impact on winter. lack of electricity, lack of good fortifications and defensive terrain, that's a problem in warmer months. When it gets colder, that can grow more and more dire. As well as, we did see Russia not wanting to use FABs due to the massive impact that has on civilian infrastructure, and now we're seeing those used more and more. I think Kursk, I can't see why Ukraine is still holding Kursk and not an in and out. My answer would be because I think they've gone, we can't actually now withdraw out of Kursk. As Ukraine loses more territory in Kursk, it would make it more difficult for Ukrainian forces to maneuver and easier for Russian troops to observe movements in the Ukrainian-controlled areas. So as it gets smaller and smaller, you've got a smaller and smaller area to have your ISR assets looking on what is happening. Just like my friend has said here, that they know everything. Therefore, worrying about security has been a bit down the list. The fate of Russian region would largely depend on whether Moscow prioritises the Kursk operation, as Russia is not facing a threat from Ukraine holding onto these areas from a military point of view, that he explained. Again, this is regardless of politics, regardless of optics in here. Why would Russia deploy the assets in here and prioritise this to push back? Now, of course, there are political reasons for this, but militarily, it seems to me that the best way here for Russia would be to just hold those forces in there, fortify your lines, hold an amount of forces in there, because it is tying up assets from Ukraine, who has numerically less numbers than you do. It's tying them up somewhere. You'll have an easier time on the front line other areas. This is why Kursk makes no sense to me, knowing the problems Ukraine has around a lack of weapons and a lack of men. The Ukrainians don't really control anything that important in terms of, for example, cities or areas. And they aren't really threatening Russia with anything important by holding this area. Adding the situation has become increasingly political for Moscow. So, again, what do we say? Any terrain that does not have vital industrial centre is irrelevant. But Russia can be dragged in the trap here of fighting for something that isn't relevant just because it is theirs. The recent Western permission to strike into Russia with long-range weaponry paved the way to Kyiv hit military targets from afar. This has been the only success of Kursk so far, is getting a sign-off to use those systems. Has it been game-changing? No. Soldiers on the ground say they had not felt the results of the long-range strikes on the battlefield. Co-founder and chairman of Ukrainian Security and Cooperation Centre said long-range strikes help a lot in, say, neutralising ammunition stockpiles. And this means that they have lowered their fighting capacity, saying they understand, by the Russians, they already can't count on this warehouse and they must rearrange, make adjustments and make plans from new calculations because of the threat of these weapon systems. The effect is still probably rather limited, as the Ukrainian missile stocks are also limited. Low stocks and the range of these don't allow Ukraine to conduct a large-scale strike campaign targeting substantial number of headquarters, and a lot of those have been moved out of the range of these as well, especially then those long-range strategic bombers such as the Su-34 or your Tu aircraft, therefore can't paralyse the entire system. The stocks of these isn't Ukrainian stocks that are low when you talk Storm Shadow Scalp, it's Western stocks that are low of these. Because the permission to shoot the missiles on Russian soil was given so late, the missile stocks are limited. It really means that it's a nice bonus, but it won't change the larger dynamics of the battle. The critical components would instead be manpower, quality of troops, and the availability of equipment, drones, artillery. Again, no shit. That we have said again and again. Things like the F-16s, the time, the money spent on these to see no real change on the battlefield, when the thing that is needed is infantry and armour. But again, in my opinion, this goes into this obsession with optics. It's not good PR to just, we train these soldiers and a photo of a dude with a rifle. Good PR is, we've got this Aiden, we've got this Charlie, we've got this F-16, we've got this missile. It's not saying they don't help, especially the strategic assets like the missiles, F-16s. They can help. But your first order should be, we need the manpower and artillery first. Exactly like it's saying here, they would help more. And the more and more guys I speak to, they're like, we don't give a shit about those systems because we're getting bloody overrun at front lines. We don't have thermals, we don't have men, we don't have bloody quality equipment or enough just people in any of these positions. A bunch of combat-ready units are being wiped out by the Russian forces. The soldier from the 80th Brigade deployed to Kursk Oblast said, stressing how exhausted his guys were. It's possible that I don't know something or don't understand something, but it's shit. And that's why I've said I'm somewhat agnostic on Kursk. Every bone in my body goes, this is a military mistake. But like Ilya here, that it's possible that I don't know something and that I'm missing something and it will be a success. But at this point in time, I think that the areas as Rugledar through to Pokrovsk, a lot of that has sped up dramatically. And the kilometre square shows this since the operation into Kursk. So let's talk further then about concessions. Now, I believe that Ukraine's tone overall, especially those Zelensky and other officials, has had a huge shift in the past months. It's gone from no concessions at all, 1991 borders, the arrest of Putin, anything less than that is a loss. Put an asterisk there. To the idea that concessions, if Ukraine can be part of NATO. And realistically, the reason for this is that I believe Zelensky fears that Ukraine can't stop the Russian advance. The only thing that can stop this advance is hitting the hard stoppers of NATO, and that border needs to be brought up to where they're fighting, not all the way back in Poland or the Dnieper River. That's why I believe this rhetoric has changed dramatically. If Zelensky truly believed that Ukraine was going to fight and win back all of this territory, you wouldn't be seeking these security deals right now. You say that doesn't matter, we need that after the war, let's get something signed for after the war, which we know after the war, especially if Ukraine would have a victory, that would get signed off regardless. Russia wouldn't have a say. But if he really believed that, it would be, the first order would be, we just need a heap of men, we need this, we need to fight through, the deal wouldn't be there. But something that I've spoken about at length prior and over a long time is this idea of selling a victory. And Russian media posted this today, but they call it the image of victory. Important topic at this seminar, Russian seminar, was the image of victory and public opinion regarding those returning from the SVO, so Special Military Operation, so the area of the war. The presidential administration proceeds from the fact that they will end the special military operation will come, that the end is going to come and it could come quickly and that we must be prepared for it. The future results of this operation should be regarded in society as a victory, although different social groups already perceive it differently. For the angry patriots, it means one thing. For the liberals, it means something completely different. Therefore, from a point of view of the presidential administration, we must focus on the calm majority, which will be satisfied with the achievement of the goals outlined from the president. Of course, here, denazification and demilitarization. So this is what I've said. Some point in this, Russia and Ukraine, they're going to try and sell a victory, especially if that border stops here. Now, what I will say is I believe, and I've said this prior, selling a victory, I believe, will be a lot easier for the Russians. Russia has never had a super clear line in the sand of what is victory and what is failure. Nowhere near as much as Ukraine. So, for example, Ukraine, the return to 1991 borders. For Russia, they might say denazification or demilitarization. And what I've said here is, well, one in that is far easier to measure than the other. What is the measurement for denazification? What is the measurement for demilitarization? Fucking very hard. What is the measurement for 1991 border? Well, that's simple. It's this. That's where I think Ukraine's going to have a far more difficult time trying to sell a victory to the population than Russia may, on just the metrics given and the lofty goals. For Ukraine, NATO entry may be this, and it may then upend then Russians, say, demilitarization if Ukraine do join NATO, but this is going to be more and more difficult as the real constant stated goal by the Russian forces was never a clear, this is the territory. It has been to prevent NATO entry. So where we'll see that land, as far as where it actually ends, we don't know. But I believe at this point in time, the hardest thing is going to be selling a victory, but also having people accept that too. And this is where both in Russia and in Ukraine, I think we could see a lot of unrest depending on how this war ends, especially with the ideological groups that can be operating. Now, this was by Kyodo News, Japanese. Well, Zelensky says Ukraine wants to retake occupied land by diplomacy. This is a huge difference. Ukrainian president said Sunday that his country is seeking an early end to the war with Russia and return of part of its territory by Moscow through diplomacy after Kyiv's NATO membership becomes certain. Russian advancing further in the eastern parts of Ukraine, Zelensky said support for his country from its partners were not enough and urged NATO to invite Kyiv for membership talks with the transatlantic military alliance as soon as possible. Responding to all questions in Ukraine, he frankly admitted it is difficult to retake by force some of the Russian-occupied parts of the country, including Crimea, that Russia annexed in 2014. I would say that it is currently impossible. Our army lacks the strength to do it. That is true. We do have to find a diplomatic solution, and this goes into what I said before. that I think the shift in this tone has been that Zelensky is basically saying through this that we can't stop the Russians in this way, therefore, or take it back, therefore we need those hard stoppers of NATO and that position of NATO to maybe have diplomatic actions to take this back. What diplomatic solution could be found to make Russia hand back that and warm water port and this and that? I have absolutely no idea. I believe Russia can rely on sanctions being lifted just over time. That the longer things go on, different companies are going to eventually lift sanctions. So if it was, we'll lift sanctions, I think, one, I don't know even if that would happen if it was instant, but even the extent that Russia go, they're not lifting sanctions to do this, I think they would go, in a decade, you'll lift sanctions. I don't know. But he went on to say that such steps could be considered only when we know that we are strong enough. So if we are strong enough, if Russia at one point may hit the hard stoppers of NATO, therefore, we may look at guns falling silent and diplomatic actions. Suggesting Ukraine's readiness to negotiate the return of some parts of the occupied areas after the conflict is over, provided necessary conditions are met. His remarks appear to represent a shift in his long-held position that his country will fight to regain all territory seized by Russia. Zelensky expressed appreciation for Japan, the US and South Korea and numerous European countries for providing assistance, but stressed that more help is needed to strengthen Ukraine. More weapons, more men are needed for even stopping the front at the moment, let alone going on the offensive. We have seen Kursk say, though, these areas need to be won back militarily. But of course, he's a military commander, not a politician. It can be a bit blurry in very senior ranks. The 46-year-old president did not say how many North Korean troops initially transferred to eastern Russia in October had been killed or wounded against Ukrainian forces. He said there is evidence that 12,000 North Korean soldiers have been deployed to Russia's Kursk region bordering Ukraine, but Kyiv needs to have proof before disclosing the exact number of casualties. These soldiers are so far missing. We haven't seen it. We see a lot less actually talk about it. I believe the North Korean thing, we know North Koreans are there, whether they're for training, whether they're doing whatever, we don't know, but I believe, a little bit like Kursk, it could be a way to try and have got access to those South Korean weapon systems. Since South Korea has said no even to the sale of systems, I wouldn't be surprised if we see the idea of these North Koreans fighting in Kursk and could cross into Sumy. I think that we may miraculously see that disappear. He predicted that many North Korean soldiers will be sent to the front lines of the war in the future. And it is indisputable that Russian President Vladimir Putin will use them as cannon fodder to reduce losses to his country's military. Again, we haven't seen it yet. Although, this is where it goes against it a bit, in an attempt to attract tens of thousands of additional North Korean soldiers, Zelensky said that Russia has been treating the dispatched troops well. Well, to try and attract more and more, he's not going to use them as cannon fodder. It's either one or the other. What may matter in the long run, he said, is that North Korean soldiers will have been trained by the Russian military in actual war conditions as they seek to acquire knowledge of more modern systems, such as drones and other technologies. He warned this would have a tremendous impact on Asia and elsewhere if they bring such know-how back to North Korea. And this is that sort of hybrid warfare seesaw that people are running, especially South Korea is going, there's been a deployment of this, but if we supply arms to Ukraine, Russia may give more tech or more training to North Korea. South Korea is in a very difficult spot because they want to support Ukraine and then the West. They want to, target the North Koreans there, but they don't want to have Russia give further technology or further training into North Korea. So it's this hard jigsaw of what do you do, what don't you do? And of course, South Korea has basically said, we're not even selling equipment because of this. And like I've said, South Korea is conventionally significantly more powerful than North Korea. But if you look at certain technologies that North Korea is after, if, say, Russia were to give North Korea some technologies, it really levels the playing field in many regards. What I'm talking about is big bombs that we know North Korea specifically want. Conventionally, economically, will North Korea ever compete with South Korea? No. But if you have ultimate deterrence, you don't really need to. Does that make sense? It's like what I say about Australia. Will conventionally Australia, economically, militarily, in whatever factor, be able to compete in like a war with China? God, no. But take away our alliances, take that out of the factor, just Australia v China. But this is why I believe Australia should be a nuclear power. If you've got that ultimate deterrence, well, it is the ultimate deterrence, and that is what South Korea would not want, or just a heap of really high-end, trained, and experienced guys re-entering to filter through the militaries either. One thing we'll see after this war is many Ukrainians be deployed in other corners of the globe to train forces in conventional and drone warfare. Should absolutely be done as soon as possible. The amount of conventional warfighting experience is incredibly limited in all corners of the globe, from officers to private soldiers, except for the Russians, Ukrainians, and those who have gone to join that war. The interview, which lasted about an hour, was granted as the war in Ukraine has reached a critical juncture, with questions also arising as to whether the US support for Ukraine will continue after President-elect Donald Trump takes office. But what should be is, no matter what's put on the table, will Putin still not agree to it unless it is huge? Because Putin and his commanders may be looking and going, it doesn't matter what Trump gives to Ukraine other than men. We're going to, if they are seeing that manpower is the number one issue, they may be going, well, we don't care if the US increases military aid to Ukraine, because it's going to be hard for us, but we're going to eventually take more and more. I think the bit people leave out of this is also convincing Putin to come to the table as well. It's very, very difficult. And if these do go forward, I don't know. I think Putin's requests will be huge. I can't see it being absolutely any less than the 4 Oblast plus Crimea. Trump has repeatedly claimed that Russia's invasion of Ukraine would never have happened if he were in office. Zelensky said Trump and his team knew Ukraine's position and its victory plan that is aimed at putting in a strong position to allow diplomacy to take place. Of course, long-range strikes, that has been ticked off, but security guarantees not yet ticked off on that victory plan, which leads then into the 10-point peace plan. The studying the plan, we're going to hear from him, there will be no capitulation from our side of Ukraine. That's a fact. I think that he understands. So when we say concessions, he's not giving up that ground, but he's saying we'll get that back at some point, but the guns need to fall silent. We'll do it diplomatically, but I don't know how that diplomatic action will take place. In my opinion, if the guns fall silent, that's where the border's going to end. If the border's there and the guns are silent, I don't think anyone's going to give up fucking anything. That's in my opinion. And we talked about Kursk. Kursk is 500 square kilometres, 110,000. I think that might be a swap there, even at 5 to 1, 10 to 1, still fairly irrelevant. They're studying the plan, which we do know from even the most pro-Ukrainian politicians that they were disappointed with the plan from lacking substance. Amid rising global concern over Russia's deepening cooperation with North Korea, bringing the third country into an ongoing 33-month war, Joe Biden authorised Ukraine to fire American long-range missiles at targets. Now, this is what I say is North Korean soldiers so far have done a shitload more for Ukraine than they have for Russia so far. What they've done for Ukraine is allow long-range strikes back into Russia. We haven't seen any of these soldiers pop up yet. We haven't seen any evidence of them actually fighting. And 10,000 in an army of over 1 million is very little numbers. They don't speak the language, they've got no combat experience and questionable bloody training. So they've done a shitload more for Ukraine so far than the Russians. This goes into my idea of, well, are they going to be fighting at all? Or was it a very, very successful misinformation campaign based off Russia training some North Koreans in some areas? Let's use that to get these strikes, and it'll be very, very clever. Again, what we've said is a good propaganda needs an element of truth. Are there North Koreans in Russia? Yes. Therefore, these weapons and allocation may open up and policy shift. Are there ones fighting? Well, if they're there, we can do that. So good propaganda, you have an element of truth, and then you push on that. And that's something I'm going to be speaking about very soon, about the Russian economy. Is it collapsing? Is the ruble dropping? Yes. But the question is, is that a sign that it is collapsing? That's the question that I'm going to be asking a professional in this field. Legends, this went long. Have a great day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.